This is part one of a lecture on photosynthesis, or the process of making glucose or sugar, for Bio 101 for September 23rd, 2020. And in this lecture today, we're going to define photosynthesis. We're going to talk about the chemical equation for photosynthesis. We're going to talk about where in plants photosynthesis takes place, as well as some of the important organelles and structures involved. We're going to then talk more about the specifics of photosynthesis process, as well as how plants have adapted photosynthesis for hot and dry climates. And so you probably have studied photosynthesis before in another biology class, either in high school or middle school or even elementary school. And so you're probably sitting here thinking, why should we even care about studying something that happens in plants? It's not relevant to humans, and so why are we even bothering to talk about it? And the reason that we are talking about it, and the reason why we should care about photosynthesis, is because we need to breathe and we need to eat. And photosynthesis is the process that releases almost all of the oxygen gas that we breathe into the atmosphere. And photosynthesis also generates most of the energy required not just by humans, but by all living things on Earth, by generating glucose, which can be broken down into ATP in the process we talked about last lecture. And it's not that people are not continuing to study photosynthesis or to try to manipulate it in science today. We're actually studying ways to genetically modify the pathways involved in photosynthesis and tweak some of the enzymes involved in those metabolic pathways to help boost plant growth. And boosting plant growth can be great from a profit standpoint in the case of tobacco, right? And so if you can modify photosynthesis and create a genetically modified crop or a plant, you can create more yield. And from a profit side or from a money-making side, that is good. It's also good in terms of solving kind of like a world crisis or a health crisis issue in the form of world hunger. If we can genetically modify photosynthesis to maybe be more efficient and make more glucose, we can boost the growth of plants, especially in maybe like environments where plants don't normally grow as well, to boost the amount of food available for people in these locations and help kind of with issues of hunger and food shortages all over the world. And so studying photosynthesis, knowing how it works, is not only important from an individual perspective, because we need to breathe and we need to eat, but also kind of from a global perspective, because being able to genetically modify plants so that they're better at photosynthesis could be something that's helpful to a lot of people. And just to sort of review from last time, I want to talk a little bit about the energy that we need in order to survive. And as we talked about in the previous lecture, cells constantly need a supply of energy for their metabolic reactions. And that's not untrue of photosynthesis either. Photosynthesis also needs energy in order to make glucose. And the main energy molecule, or the energy currency of cells, is ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. And ATP is good at storing a lot of energy that's needed by cells in the bonds between these phosphate groups. And then that energy can be released whenever it's needed to power metabolic reactions. And so respiration is the process of taking sugar or glucose and adding oxygen gas in order to break down that glucose into carbon dioxide and water, as well as to generate energy in the form of ATP. And you can see here that ADP, as well as the energy absorbed from food or glucose when it's broken down, is used to generate ATP, which can then be used for energy for the cell. And so really we want to talk about, where does the glucose come from, right? So we know that we need to take in glucose We can't generate it ourselves because we as humans are other feeders, or heterotrophs. Right? And so heterotrophs are organisms that eat other things or gain their nutrition from another organism. And so for us, the glucose comes from a different source. It comes from potentially eating plants, sugars, other foods. Whereas plants themselves are what are considered autotrophs, or self-feeders. They make their own food, right? In particular, plants are a specific type of autotroph known as a photoautotroph, where they can make their own food from light, in particular sunlight. Right? And so plants and some types of algae are what are known as photoautotrophs. And the glucose in plants, therefore, is made by the plants themselves, whereas we have to take in glucose from other sources because we are heterotrophs. And so what I just want to reiterate is that technically all of the food that we eat, whether it's a steak or a piece of corn, comes from the autotrophs, all of that glucose, right? So if it is a plant that we're eating, like a piece of corn, technically that corn took in sunlight and made its own glucose. And we gain glucose by eating that plant. But even if we're eating a steak, which is another type of heterotroph, right? It comes from a cow. But that cow had to eat grass. And therefore that cow had to obtain its glucose from that autotrophic plant, grass. And then we obtain glucose from the cow in the form of a steak. And so technically all of the glucose that we take in as heterotrophs, even up higher kind of on that food chain, goes back to the plants or to the photoautotrophs. So how do autotrophs actually make their own food from the sunlight? Our photoautotrophs use a process known as photosynthesis, where they make glucose or sugar from carbon dioxide, CO2, water or H2O, and sunlight. And you can see glucose here on the other side of the equation, or the product side. And in the process of making glucose through photosynthesis, plants also release oxygen gas, or O2, into the atmosphere. And so this is the chemical equation that I want you to memorize for the purposes of this class. 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O yields 1 glucose molecule and 6 oxygen molecules. And in terms of kind of normal words, you can see the carbon dioxide plus water with the addition of sunlight making sugar. And in the next part of the lecture, we're going to talk about how photosynthesis process takes place, as well as where specifically in the plant's photosynthesis happens.